Barbara is currently an IS Fellow, Aarhus Institute for Advanced Studies Fellow, but previously she was based at the University of Birmingham. She held a Marie Curie postdoc fellowship there. Prior to that, she was at LMU in Munich, studied in Australia as well, so New Zealand, not Australia, sorry, coming to us with a wealth of diverse international experiences. So really, thank you so much for coming over to us, Barbara. It's absolutely fantastic.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here and present my work on functional connectivity patterns supporting working memory and attention processes. Bear with me, we have a few hiccups, so I don't see what slide comes next. So. Right, the outline. First we'll cover a few basics because I know you all have a very diverse background. So we talk about attention, working memory and oscillations in general before we go to the my study specifics of how this all comes together, and hopefully we can finish with a few studies on looking into how it manifests in the human brain when working memory is impaired, for instance like in schizophrenia patients. Right, what is attention? Well, there are several ways of looking at attention. There is top-down and bottom-up modulated attention. The best example is, you'll probably know, the cocktail party phenomena. So you talk to a friend in a noisy environment at a party, and you concentrate, top-down, attend to what your friend is saying to follow the conversation, and then you hear your name at the other end of the room. Not particularly loud, but it's a very salient stimulus, so you will attend to the person who called your name. This is bottom-up attention, just attention grabbing. How it can be measured is, for instance, with cueing paradigms, and what we measure in the lab is that what is cued, so indicated there's something coming up on your left, so you attend to your left, you will react faster to something that comes up on the left than if it comes up on the right. Very straightforward. And I hope this works.
It will.
I have a little video to show you what I mean.
Start the sound on your computer too.
Sound what? I unmute myself.
No, just the sound down there.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Okay, I'll just play that video for you. It's self-explanatory if you try to follow along.
Watch this next sequence carefully. At the end, I'll ask you a question about what you've seen.
Hi, I'm Magic Singh, and today we're in Portobello Road, and I'm going to show you guys a classic in magic, using matches. And today to help me out is Mark. Mark, tell you what, place your hand up for me nice and flat. Now I promise this won't hurt, alright? So here's the idea, let's just light this up. And if you close onto that nice and tight, here we go, watch this.
Keep watching.
I don't know if you felt that or not. I'll tell you what, have a look inside. Open it up. See how the match is actually returned into the book, and it's still burnt. Okay, you're not impressed. Alright, it was my first trick ever. But here's the idea. Just place that back in your hand, close it tight, and turn it face down again if you can. Now we're going to use one more thing, and we're going to use a magician's best friend, playing cards. Now the idea is really simple. You're going to choose one. So take anyone you like. Perfect. Have a look for yourself, and do me a favour, show the camera as well if you can. Brilliant. And you know what? Place it back face up on the deck. Now, it doesn't matter if I see what the card is, because we're going to do something completely different. Just watch this. Here we go. Follow it slowly. Watch the king. I don't know if you felt that or not. Tell you what, have a look inside. Open it up. Check it out.
It's the King of Diamonds. It's my card.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Very much.
Did you watch the trick closely? This is a famous illusion called inattention blindness. This illusion is not about the magic. While watching the routine, you may or may not have noticed the changes taking place. The question is, how many changes did you see? Was there 1, were there 3, or were there 5?
Anyone? Did anyone see any change?
You can turn off your sound again, and I'll start the
We need it still.
mic here.
Okay. Indicating. It's really good. I'll play it on.
The answer is there were 3 changes. The first change was the red hanky to a green one. The second was his shirt swapping to a t-shirt. The last was his assistant becoming a completely different person. How many did you see? So why is it that you didn't see these big changes? And the reason is that the brain receives so much information on its eyes that you can't see everything simultaneously. So instead it picks and chooses according to what it thinks is important. If you change something that it doesn't think is important, you just literally don't see it.
All right. Nope. The Zoom has the other one. All good?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So as you can see, that works really well. You're probably all a bit more familiar with this one. So it's the same theory. You watch a basketball team, you have to usually count how many passes the white team has. And then there's this black gorilla going through making, everyone knows that. That's why it's really not cool anymore to show it. But the internet is full of inattention and blindness videos, and you know exactly what to look for. You still miss it. So if you're bored or you want to procrastinate, I strongly recommend Googling or YouTubing inattention or blindness video. This just shows us that attention is also limited. It's very focused, and if you see a change or if you see the gorilla, that's bottom up. It's something that grabs your attention. But it's blocked out and inhibited by you focusing your capacity limited attention onto the things that you really think are relevant. Why this is also relevant outside of a gorilla or lab studies, especially if you live in Denmark, if you think about traffic, road traffic, bad visibility, loads of cars, bikes, pedestrians, rain, and so on and so on. If you don't focus on the road, but you focus on your phone, for instance, there are millions of studies showing how this can actually go really pear-shaped. Even you don't notice that you're actually driving less well because, well, you don't attend to it that well, so you don't realize that you're doing badly. You lose some of that limited attention and capacity to put it somewhere else. And that can be fairly detrimental. So how does that relate to working memory? Attention and working memory are inherently linked. Working memory is basically attending to your inside world, to the information in your mind. You're holding that in your mind, you're manipulating it, it allows you to operate in your environment. For instance, now listening to me and trying to think how that relates to your own studies. Especially if you think about what was in that spotlight of attention. You probably all know it was bats, and that's fairly simple, like short-term memory or long-term memory, depending on how long I've been talking. But if I ask you to swap them around, so flip them around the vertical axis, and try to see is the bat that ends up on the left, is it at the top or the bottom? Anyone? I go back to the attention. Now the top right one will be on the left. So the left bat is at the top. So that is something where you recalled information into your working memory and you try to use that information to solve a task at hand, in this case, fairly simple. Another example is following a recipe. Cooking, trying to keep up with how much of which ingredient goes in, what needs to go in. having a conversation with friends. A meaningful conversation usually means that you respond to something the person said. You relate it to yourself. All this happens in working memory. And this shameless bit of self-advertisement in the middle is reading a paper. You usually do that goal-directedly. There is a meaning you want to extract. You have a goal. What do I want to find out? That sort of thing. Or just following an origami, trying to fold that, trying to remember, well, between looking at the instructions and looking at your sheet, how that needs to be folded, which can get increasingly difficult. In a more lab-based environment, I want to show you how else we can use working memory in a very controlled, boring lab way. So I'm going to present you with a few numbers, and you just try to keep those in mind while they're off the screen, and then you compare them to the numbers that are coming up after, and you tell me whether it's the same or different. Okay? I'll show it very briefly. Same or different? Different. Yeah. And some of you might have used some sort of strategy like that. Chunk it together. What happens if you chunk it together? It becomes less. Because the 215 is, in our very trained, also number-heavy society, it's an entity versus 215. It's usually harder to retain than 215. Yeah. And another example of when that might be useful is if you're presented with something like this. I give you a bit more time. Okay. Same or different?
Same.
Mm-hmm. And now a classic working memory. So that was more kind of if you really want to distinguish short-term memory, working memory type thing. So now coming to the working memory bit of it, which number was not represented in that string of numbers? So now you activate the numbers in your head and you try to figure something out. So which number was not there?
8.
Yes! Okay, which one was double?
7?
2.
No. 5. No, and 2.
Okay.
I missed that. All right. Perfect. So what you did is reactivate the number sequence and you try to figure out what's going on. And yeah. Now, one last. Try to remember that. And now rearrange them backwards. 5, 6, 19, 21, 3, 7. Same, different. What that should show, so that's the same, but what that should show is working memory is also very prone to interference, but only relevant interference. Earlier I could just keep talking and you were relatively fine with still following up with remembering the numbers. But as soon as you throw numbers, that is actually that information that you're currently working with is getting very tricky, and you really need to work hard to try to protect your internal representation. So what we learned, working memory is temporary storage and the utilization of information that is relevant and in a goal-directed manner. It allows us to work with information that is currently relevant without actually losing track of what we're doing. So that goal-directedness is, again, important. It's linked to attention. It's limited in its capacity. It's sensitive to interference. And it's a conscious process. I'm interested in the brain. And we all know it's really complicated. Someone went through the pain and mapping connections and putting little pictures of areas that are relevant for what. And as you can see, it's not that straightforward as a long time ago we used to believe that, oh, this is the motor cortex, that's fine if you want to do something, that's the area light up. It's all connected and working together. And what I'm particularly interested in is those connections, those lines between regions, because I'm super interested in how those different areas work together to solve a current task. And one way of doing that is by looking at electric brain activity, or the magnetic field generated by the electric activity that is generated by millions of neurons working together. And we can pick that up with EEG electrodes or MEG electrodes, OPM sensors, MEG sensors, OPM sensors. In another way, you can measure metabolic changes with fMRI, but that's a more indirect measure of blood flow changes. And this is a direct measure of the activity of neurons underlying. So we don't measure action potentials in firing, but what we do measure is the input into the neurons, so that dendritic input of a lot of neurons. And what I'm looking at is oscillations. So one way of analyzing those electrical brain activities is you link it to a stimulus, like you present a flash, and then you present a flash again and again and again, and a lot of times, and you average the activity, and you get an ERP or ERF, a waveform that is very specific, and it's very locked to that stimulus that tells us something about its activation and also where in the brain it's located. What you do with oscillations is the brain signal, as we measure it, like over there, you can split that in different frequencies. And it's composed of periodic signals. So what that means is that music is periodic, for instance. It's got a beat or a pendulum. So those are periodic signals. That, or a sine wave. It goes up and down and up and down. And that's what's an oscillation. In theory, it's something, it's a very complicated or mechanical description of something. It's just, something has an equilibrium, and then there is a force pulling it in one way. And if the force pulling it back to the equilibrium is equally strong with the force that's pulling it away, you will get an oscillation. And if there is no resistance, no friction, it would just go on forever, like a pendulum swings. But usually there is gravity pulling it to the center. So if you imagine that in a completely friction, gravity-less environment, the pendulum would just go exactly from one side to the other forever. So in terms of oscillations, there are several parameters that will be relevant. So you've got the frequency. So that is the cycle. That means nothing else but how many oscillations do you get within 1 second. 10 hertz means 10 cycles per second. 100 hertz means 100 cycles per second. 1 hertz, 1 cycle per second. Amplitude is how high this oscillation is. So in this case, how far down that swings and back up. And phase is phase where on the sine wave we are. So an oscillation is described by a circle, minus pi plus pi. And as you can see, up is here, and then it goes down here, up, down, up, down. So that's the phase. It's very abstract, and I hope it will become a tiny bit clearer. So those are different frequencies of oscillations, just the classic ones, like alpha, eyes closed, alpha goes up. Everyone is probably familiar with that. Fast frequencies, slow frequencies, and they've been traditionally ascribed to different operations. Like alpha is when we are sleepy and when our eyes are closed, and beta used to be purely motoric. Delta and theta used to be actually for when you fall asleep, slow wave sleep and so on. It's not as straightforward as that. They interact with each other, and they also work in different operations. But just so everyone has seen one of those before, so that's the traditional alpha frequency. That's the first observed oscillation, like 100 years ago. You can see that with the naked eye if you just have a participant close their eyes. The top, it's called excited and relaxed, but what it was is eyes open, eyes closed. So when you close your eyes, alpha goes up over areas that process visual information. And that means that there's no visual information coming in. And our brain needs to preserve resources. You don't want to waste any resources when there is nothing to process. You inhibit. So alpha goes up, and you prevent or you stop processing in those visual areas. And that's what you can see here. Everyone's seen one of those before. I'll just quickly explain. So that's time. As you can see, eyes open and then eyes closed. And that's the frequencies. 40 hertz, 20 hertz, and around 10 hertz, that's the alpha I was talking about. Then if you follow the time on the 10 hertz, you can see that when the participant closed the eyes, it becomes red. And red means stronger, meaning alpha goes up when the participant closed the eyes, indicating that visual areas are downregulated. And how does that now relate to attention and working memory? In terms of attention, it's this very classical lateralization studies where you present, as I said earlier, you present a cue to the left. The participant knows I need to attend to what's coming up on my left. And before the information is even coming up, alpha is going up on the side that is not expecting a stimulus, preventing information there to be processed, to free up energy for processing the information in the area that you are actually expecting information to come up. And that makes you react faster. So that is the presentation of the cue, the presentation of the actual stimulus that I have to wait for, and this is alpha. As I said earlier, red means going up, more alpha means less processing, and blue means alpha going down, means good for processing. And that is localized to the back of the head, where you expect that visual information coming in. At the same time, we also look at fast frequencies. Fast frequencies are not for preparation. They are for actual information processing. So we see gamma, for instance, going up if we process information. So it's the other way around from alpha, because alpha goes up to inhibit, gamma goes up to process. Okay? It's a bit. I will not add the lateralization bit in here. The only thing you need to see is alpha going up before the information comes to prepare the brain for not processing information. I go here, that's better. Alpha going down before the stimulus coming up to prepare the brain for fast processing. And then after the stimulus has come up, in order to process the stimulus, gamma is going up. And that will allow optimal information processing and response. And that's a very top-down driven process that is not just relying on the back of the head, but also strongly on frontal regions. Now, let's put this all into working memory. In working memory, similar paradigm, you are presented with information before, so not cued, but you're presented with information, and then you have to retain. So similar like what we did with the numbers. You retain the information for 2 seconds, or 3 seconds, and then you're presented saying that yes, no. So what happens if I am presented with an orientation stimulus, so visual spatial information? In visual spatial regions, gamma goes up. So that shows that's 5220 hertz. And that little square is around 70 to 90. So that's fast frequencies, that's gamma. That's for active information processing. But here, there is no actual information on the screen. So that is the internal representation of the information that had been there, which is also manifested in fast frequency activity. So in the absence of actual anything presented on the screen. At the same time, obviously, you also have alpha activity that is irrespective of this. What it shows on the left and on the right are just control conditions. And that shows that in regions relevant for visual spatial processing, gamma goes up only when I process visual spatial information. Not when I process a color, for instance. Then nothing happens. Okay? Now, we know posterior fast frequencies help to process information visually. So we're always talking about vision. And also to retain that visual information, to keep it in mind when it's not actually there on screen anymore. And we also know that this is a top-down guided process. Well, it's a task. You do that goal-directed. And what I want to convince you is that this top-down process is at least partly coordinated by frontal theta, which is a very circumscribed focal increase, so that's not like alpha, it's not inhibition, increase in activity over frontal regions that is estimated to come most likely, but the correspondence between fMRI and EEG, MEG is not a clear match, unfortunately, from the anterior cingulate cortex. So the region over the corpus callosum at the front, which goes actually all the way here. And we are talking about the dorsal bit. So some of you might know ACC activity for emotional processing. So that's more the ventral bit. I'm talking about the dorsal regions. And in the EEG, it's really nicely, so you can't confuse it with eye movements because it's a real nice like blob in the frontal central regions over AFZ, FZ electrodes. And it increases with task difficulty, more load, more effort, so that sort of thing. Here, I'm mainly looking at phase. So that is where on this sinus wave I am. So remember, it's basically just going round and round. And what I'm trying to convince you is it does actually matter where on that circle you are. Yeah. You can imagine that a bit, because I do realize it's really, really weirdly abstract. So you can imagine that everyone knows this fishing game. So there are those fish, and you try to catch them. You try to have this little hook, and you need to get that in when the mouth is open, and then you need to pull it up when the mouth is closed. Otherwise, you won't be able to pull one out. And it's just going like this. And what I'm saying is that it does actually matter where. So if you can throw the fishing rod at the fish however long you want. If the mouth is closed, you won't be able to catch it. Just keep it like that for now. Okay, so let's wrap this all up with working memory. The task is you see a grid and you see either 1 or 4 squares on a grid. And they're either green or they're red. So, easy and most difficult condition. You see either 1 square on a grid and it's green. So what you do so that's just for 500 milliseconds. And what you do for 2 seconds is you just remember where that item is. That's all you do. And then you see, after 2 seconds, you see a probe, which is where you have to answer it's the same or it's not the same. It's fairly simple. Then a bit more difficult is when you see 4 items. And you try to remember where on this grid those are. In this case, that's wrong. In a non-match condition, there was always just 1 item misplaced in one of the adjacent locations. So it wasn't random, but it was very similar, just a tiny bit different. In the rate manipulation condition, what you had to do is you see this 1 item, and in the delay period, you had to mirror the item. So in this case, this would need to be here. And that's very difficult when there are 4 items on the screen. But it's very doable. Just you have to really concentrate a lot. And in terms of theta, you get this really nice blob in the middle because it's hard. And this is what that shows. So that is the difference also in terms of difficulty. The more difficult, the stronger you will have this theta blob. And it really is very focal with EEG in the front AFZ, FZ electrodes. But remember I said that information processing at the back of the head expressed with fast frequencies. And I also said that this is also there in the absence of actual visual information. So when I just try to retain that information. And that is called gamma activity, so broadband gamma activity. What this is we took the phase of the frontal theta activity from here, so just the information on where on this circle you are, and divided it in 10 phase bins. And then we sorted for the different conditions for this retention interval, so where you try to actively maintain that information or manipulate that information. Sort the fast frequencies into those theta bins and map how strong gamma is depending on the phase bin of frontal theta. And what we found is that you actually don't really retain like continuously with fast frequency activity that information, but what happens is that you have bursts of gamma activity, bursts of this fast frequency activity that's continuously reactivated depending on the phase of frontal theta. So what it seems is that theta is some sort of pacemaker that posterior, so this top-down pacemaker where posterior activity is kind of reactivating a memory trace accordingly. And more importantly, depending on how difficult the task is, the more towards a specific phase bin you seem to lock those bursts. So in the easiest condition at the top, the red is gamma burst, so maximum gamma, and the blue is minimum gamma, so where I don't have a burst. And what you can see is ignore those lines, that's just the strength of the gamma. So in terms of phase, we're just looking at this one, and here we're just looking at the colors. So what you can see is that the red is more kind of locked to this phase in the easiest condition. And then it just moves towards the trough of this frontal theta. So meaning those gamma bursts are active at different phases of frontal theta, depending on how difficult that task is. And what we think is that, well, this top-down, this theta blob that keeps going up if something gets hard, seems to be some sort of top-down guiding mechanism that allows the access to cognitive resources from posterior regions. But this is EEG results, and what we then did is we wanted to see whether it actually is behaviorally meaningful. So does it make any sense? There are lots of things that you find with EEG or MEG that relate or correlate to behavior. But in order to be talking about a mechanism, you can only kind of do that when behavior suffers or cognition suffers when this mechanism is not there. So what we did is we used the most difficult task that had the bursts locked to the trough of frontal theta, and during the retention interval, so when you try to manipulate that, so during the really difficult cognitive effort time window, we try to disrupt the posterior region that is processing that information with a magnetic pulse. So, but how you can imagine that is a bit like this whack-a-mole game. So you have periodically a mole coming out of the hole, and you try to whack it on the head and you get points. Again, if that mole is inside the machine, you can whack on that hole as much as you want. It's not going to do anything. It really needs to come up, and then you can whack it and get the points. So if you imagine the gamma bursts and the information activation being that mole, you cannot disrupt the information if it's safely in the hole, but if it comes up and gets reactivated, you can whack it or zap it with TMS, and thus potentially destroy the memory trace, which is exactly what we saw. So when we sorted the behavioral performance depending on which frontal theta phase the TMS had been applied to at posterior regions, so where you locally process that information, behavior dropped almost to chance level, but only when we hit it at the phase that we found strongly related in the EEG study. And we take that as a causal indication that it truly has some sort of a coordinating function. We also looked at this with a spatial cueing paradigm, where you had a cue telling you have to attend to the left. Then you have a brief presentation of gratings. So gratings where you have to attend or memorize the orientation. That's a typical visual spatial working memory task, because you have to remember the orientation of those gratings. And then you retain the gratings, but mainly the cued ones. So it was a 70% valid cue. You didn't completely ignore the other, but you knew that it's most likely one on this side. And behaviorally, that's what we see. You still perform all right for the non-cued side, but clearly better for the valid ones. And what we see here is that if I prioritize, everyone knows the visual information processing. So the information presented on my left is processed in the right of my brain, because that otherwise gets very confusing. So if I prioritize my left side, the right side of my brain, so the right hemisphere, is relevant. So that's the one that needs the most cognitive resources. Thus, we expect it to be locked to the important theta phase, towards the trough. And this is exactly what we find. Whereas if the right side is not the cued one, so that's less relevant, the information seems to be locked to the opposite theta phase, taken from the frontal region. Again, indicating some sort of prioritization mechanism and access to cognitive resources. Less important information is locked to a less important frontal theta phase, needs less cognitive resources and less priority. And if we then apply TMS to the posterior region, to the right posterior region, if I had a left cue, so meaning it's really important to process that information, behavior drops again only if the TMS hits the trough. Same thing, different task. Also slightly different area, so that was a bit more posterior because it's a more visually heavy task, indicating that truly there is some sort of long-range connectivity between fast posterior regions processing that information in the absence of information and frontal theta as some sort of coordinating function. Loads of control studies, different populations, we had control sites. So if you TMS like the vertex or a different area in the brain that is not necessarily processing information locally, you didn't get any impairment in behavior. So yeah, it really speaks in several studies that there seems to be some sort of coordinating function. And now obviously, probably the title makes a lot more sense when I talk about the functional long-range connectivity supporting working memory processes. And what we think, as I pointed out, is that frontal theta is some sort of coordinator, gaining or allowing access to cognitive resources or dishing out those resources. This is not so I don't want to make an interference about directionality, but certainly it seems to be some sort of gatekeeper that gives or lets take, allows to take cognitive resources as needed. And I quickly want to zoom in on this bottom bit, because I promised cognitive deficit studies. So this is a study where we looked at patients suffering from schizophrenia. So those patients had very strong schizophrenia, and they also had cognitive impairment in that one. So they had executive processing issues. Executive dysfunction is part of many, many disorders. It's developmental disorders, autism, ADHD, neurodegenerative diseases. It's part of Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, you name it. It's traumatic brain injury. A lot of various disorders suffer from executive dysfunction. And in this case, we looked at schizophrenia patients, where the most difficult condition was not 4 but 3 items, and they had to manipulate those 3 items. And those we compared to a control sample of age, education, and gender, and everything matched control group. And what we found is, again, a replication in the control group, with the most difficult condition being locked towards the trough of frontal theta, so the most relevant trough, indicating the more difficult the task, you get access to most cognitive resources via the specific face bin. And the patients had a really, really strong coupling of those gamma bursts to frontal theta. So they had even stronger communication between those two, but in the wrong phase. So what they showed is that they locked this posterior reactivation of information to the phase of frontal theta that healthy controls used for the most easy condition, for the very easy condition, and this also manifested in worse task performance. Another indicator that this might be some sort of mechanism rather than a correlation of finding that relates to impairment. In the final bit, I think you can't see that, but it's, I don't know either, but it looks at frontal theta in the attention network. So I was talking about information being locked to frontal theta as some sort of local posterior information processing and frontal cognitive resource moderator. And what we did in a great study with fantastic collaborators at the University of Toronto and SICKIS, Nebras Vaz and George Ibrahim, was we looked at working memory paradigm very similar to the lateralization one, except they got a cue, so they got an information like this, visual spatial information, and also figural information. So visual spatial information being processed in the dorsal areas, so this spatial visual regions, and the figural ones are going more the ventral stream. So it's where you also process color or the identity of faces if you want to retain a face. So that's going more this stream. They tried to remember those, but they were cued to either prioritize the visual spatial information or the figurative information. They had to retain that for 2 seconds, and then they were asked both. So every trial they had to answer to both, but they got points, and they got double points for the prioritized information, or triple points. It was definitely more relevant, and they had to prioritize those, end up with more points in the end, but the other one they also needed to retain. And then also a study with the same task, but we applied TMS to the left posterior region, which is not necessarily the hub where you see like fast frequency lighting up if you process visual spatial information, but it is a strong part of the frontoparietal attention network, which is, again, as I said earlier, it's not really compartmentalized that, oh, posterior regions that processes visual information, in frontal there's the attention. No, you've got this whole network where different areas are involved in different things. But the right posterior region is more relevant for visual spatial processing. Language is also a bit more left lateralized. So you've got slight lateralization, but the frontoparietal attention network is bilateral. So we target the left posterior region to target attention network. And Nebras came up with this really smart way of analyzing the data, which we hadn't thought of. So what he did is actually incorporated behavior. and behavioral outcome, performance in the analysis, which I didn't readily do, unlike most of the time, so I was really, really proud of that. And what he could show is that the stronger you activate your frontal theta, so the higher frontal theta, the less you actually get correct. And this is really counterintuitive, because we always think about frontal theta activation being that, oh, cognitive resources, right? More cognitive resources, and that's good. Except actually, what he shows is the more frontal resources, the worse your performance. And if you think about it for a second, it does actually make sense. Because if I need to concentrate more, that maybe just means that in this trial, it's more difficult. Maybe I was a bit distracted. We all know that attention fluctuates. You're sitting there for 40 minutes, 30 minutes. You will drop your attentional ball sometimes and stop paying attention. Or just something else comes up, something bottom up. Your leg starts itching. It's like, oh, okay, what? What he showed is that if you activate your stronger regions, like you need to kick it more into gear, that is kind of an indication that you need more resources to solve that task. So it seems to be more difficult. And if you connect that with the TMS study, so basically kicking the frontotemporal the attention network, the frontoparietal attention network, what he shows is that if you have low frontal theta and you kick the attention network, you have all right performance. But if you have high frontal theta, meaning you would actually do worse, and you kick the attention network, your performance goes up. Meaning that if frontal theta is an indication, so power now, not phase, power. If frontal theta power is an indication for a bad attentional state, and I kick it a bit into gear with like a TMS pulse in the network, so I started the attention network a bit stronger, then your performance also goes up. If I don't stimulate, that's the orange bit, so that's what I said. If I don't stimulate, high frontal theta, so the top quarter, has less performance, less accurate performance than low frontal theta. And this is the really interesting bit. When I stimulate, when theta is high, I definitely improve performance significantly. Which is a very good indication that frontal theta is involved in the attention network, and it does have a causal role in cognitive resource allocation, access to cognitive resources. And it's a very niche thing to know, but if by any chance any frontal theta people are in the room who kind of are more inclined to thinking that frontal theta is reflecting load, working memory load, it's not. Again, it's a big thing for me, and that's very new stuff, which is going to come out very soon, hopefully. Take-home messages. Frontal midline theta plays a key role in the allocation of cognitive resources, or the access to cognitive resources, by task-relevant areas across the brain. Bursts of fast frequency, so gamma activity, are locked to specific phases of frontal theta depending on the cognitive resources the process needs. This transient functional network is behaviorally relevant, and you can disrupt behavior causally by disrupting the mechanism very specifically. And theta is like a 4 to 6 hertz rhythm, so it has 4 to 6 cycles per second, so it's very, very temporally specific. And finally, by stimulating or disrupting this frontoparietal attention network, irrespective of fast frequency activity processing actual information. So by just kickstarting this network, you can improve behavior and modulate performance, which is potentially relevant or very relevant for disorders that suffer from impairment in executive functioning. Just a quick thanks to the collaborators presented in these studies. So that's Paul Sausing in Munich, soon to be in Zurich, Birgit Griesmeier, who left for the real world, Ole Jensen in Birmingham, Thomas Minarik here, and George Ibrahim and Nebra Mazi in Toronto. Thank you.